Hey friends, it's Orf here and thank you for stopping by, and today we got another tier list video. Hold on, those are out of order. That doesn't look right. Okay, we're all good. Welcome to the Eminem tier list video. For this one, I'm going to be looking at all 12 of Eminem's full-length LPs. And we're starting off with one that some people probably think shouldn't be included, but you know I always love throwing some fun stuff in here. We're going to look at Infinite, which is actually the only of all 12 of these records that I actually had to listen to for the first time right before making this video. Yeah, I had never heard this one, so I filmed my reaction to it as well. The main thing I can say about Infinite is it kind of makes me appreciate the fact that Dr. Dre discovered Eminem and flew him out to work with him. And that's not really like a quality thing. This is definitely not an F. I think it's more of just like the sound that Eminem was giving on his debut sounds nothing like anything he did afterwards. In fact, the remastered version of the title track, I think you can find it on Apple Music and stuff like that, it sounds so polished that Eminem's voice, like it doesn't even sound like Eminem anymore. Honestly, it sounds a little bit like John Bellion, if I could compare it to anything else. He's including lyrics, themes, tones, and collaborations that would not resemble anything that he created after Infinite. He mentions religion in these lyrics, and he doesn't really do that at any other point throughout the rest of his career. And he just kind of sounds more like a late 90s, early 2000s basic Detroit rapper. I'm sure a lot of people were making albums and mixtapes at this time that sounded a lot like this. So I am glad that Eminem sort of pulled it together, really reinvented himself after this one, because honestly, like, it's good for a debut, but it doesn't really have that Eminem flair that makes it stand out. In reality, it's probably closer to like a mid-D tier album, but since it's his debut, I'll cut him some slack. I think C is fine. It's a debut. For that, for it being his first record, for not collaborating with Dr. Dre at this point, I'll say it's average. Solid C. But moving on to the Eminem that we know and love or possibly hate today, we're gonna start with the Slim Shady LP. And I truly do think this record was pretty ahead of its time. We definitely get the darker side of Eminem. So this one representing Slim Shady and the next one representing Marshall Mathers, Slim Shady being the alter ego. I definitely get that in the sense of how dark this character can be portrayed on some of these songs. So My Name Is was a huge breakout hit. This was not my introduction to Eminem. My introduction would have come later than this. But despite this one having like a few missing links, I think it does hold up well. We'll keep it in the B category because I do think it is an improvement over Infinite. It's one step up in terms of production quality, in terms of maturity as a songwriter, and just in terms of risk and uniqueness. Yeah, I think the Slim Shady LP gets the B category. And moving on to what many would usually describe as Eminem's magnum opus is the Marshall Mathers LP. And even though I don't have as much of a personal connection to this one, I can just objectively see why people say that. Honestly, right away, I can throw this one in the S category. With the Slim Shady LP representing that character, Slim Shady, the Marshall Mathers LP kind of goes pretty deep into Eminem's personal life. Not only do I think this album kind of presents such an innovation that was unheard of at the time, I think it's an extreme case of an artist putting themselves out there and essentially having no fear, essentially having like nothing to hide with a record like this. I mean, there was a good year of my life that I was listening to Stan on loop, but to be clear, we're ranking the whole album here, and I'm pretty sure there's not a single track on this album that I would classify as anything less than great. This is the one that catapulted Eminem into superstardom. It feels like never before had people seen such a raw white boy rapper that was so fearless in his delivery and the themes that he was bringing into his music. To make this video, I actually had to go back and listen to all of these albums again, which took quite a while, and with this one, I can really tell that it has aged better than any Eminem record to this day. So the Marshall Mathers LP gets an S tier. Nothing more to say about that. When it's awesome, when it's great, there's only so much you can say. Moving on to the Eminem Show, which probably would have been the first time that I actually heard an Eminem song. However, at this point, I was just too young to really find any enjoyment in this genre of music. That would have come later on. And this one does have a couple of low points that were not present on the Marshall Mathers LP. However, the hits on this thing are easily some of Eminem's best songs that he's ever made. Even though I think the Marshall Mathers LP has aged better together, tracks like Without Me, Until I Collapse are still on all of my playlists today. Okay, maybe not all of them, maybe not my like sleep tranquility playlist, but you get the idea. I think this one was Eminem taking that success that he received from the Marshall Mathers LP and just using that to its fullest potential with this improved production and also just this fearless nature that Eminem would turn into this essentially goofy, I don't give a fuck persona. And that has just stuck with so many people throughout so many years, so you cannot deny this record's quality. A couple tracks on here do tend to be a little bit rudimentary or just tracks that kind of don't deserve their runtime, get boring like halfway through a little bit. But the hits on this thing are some of Eminem's best hits. It's gonna need to go in the A category, it just seems fitting right there. And just as the Marshall Mathers LP was the response to the Slim Shady LP, Encore would be the response to the Eminem Show. And personally, after listening to this whole thing again, which I had not done, I think in the past like 10 years at least, I can kind of see why this one gets that hate within the community. I will easily stand by Mockingbird because I absolutely love that song. It is a huge part of me getting into Eminem. It still is such a fantastic track today. On the next record we look at, there's a similar track that I'll mention, but I mean, that one just blew me away and was probably my favorite Eminem song for a time. And pretty much everything else on here drags to a ridiculous degree. I do get a bit of a kick out of tracks like Just Lose It and Ass Like That, just for the hell of it, but everything else on here was just kind of a slog. It's just not my record. I want to be the one guy that says, no, Encore is actually pretty good, you guys are wrong and here's why, but I just can't. It's an E because I don't think it's a complete failure. Mockingbird, along with like maybe a couple other tracks, pretty much carry this whole record. I would not deem this a complete failure, but it is not good as an album. Moving on to Relapse, kind of like an Encore, how I mentioned that Mockingbird, fuck. Kind of like how Mockingbird carries the Encore album from an F to an E, I kind of feel the same way about Beautiful on this record. However, there's two differences. Beautiful is not as much of a departure in quality upward versus the rest of the tracks on the album because it's not quite as good, it's not quite as much of a standout, and that also means that there are some more tracks on this album that are more listenable. My favorites on here being Bagpipe, I can't even say bagpipes, bagpipe. My favorites on here being Bagpipes from Baghdad and also 3 AM, oddly enough. I know a lot of people say that his delivery on that one is cringy. I don't know, I like it, I like that song. And there's a couple more tracks on here that are manageable. I don't think the bad tracks on this one are offensively bad, I think it's just kind of boring. The lower points on this album are low for a different way than they are in Encore. They don't piss me off with their lack of quality. However, it is weird to see Eminem take like a 5-year break and then come out with a pretty lackluster record. When I was a kid and Eminem came out with Recovery and the Marshall Mathers LP2, I just kind of assumed he had been killing it for like 10 years, but that's not necessarily true. He definitely was in the early 2000s, and then he had a pretty long period where he just wasn't. And even him coming back after 5 years with more music wasn't really enough to propel him back on top. That definitely would have come with the next record. So with Relapse, we're gonna get this one a D. That sounds fair, that sounds correct. I like how this is looking so far. Moving on to, yes, my introduction to Eminem. Recovery. I was, I believe, 12 or 13 when this album was released. It was my cousins who introduced me to tracks such as Not Afraid and Love the Way You Lie featuring Rihanna. I kind of saw these tracks as like the anthem for a Gatorade commercial, you know what I mean? Like, a lot of these tracks are obviously produced to be hits, and a lot of you know that already. I truly do believe that Eminem's lyrical quality suffers on Recovery. The themes and tones he's talking about are serious for sure, but we're kind of missing a bit of flow, if I could describe it that way. I think it's just mainly like the tempo and the blown out production of these tracks that kind of focus more towards Eminem's like harsh sound voice where he's like, he sounds angry, he's almost screaming, but yet it still doesn't sound extremely emotional. I swear, it's like so hard to describe. But to be fair, this would be the first album from Eminem in quite a while that doesn't just have one or maybe two big hits and everything else is just blech. In addition to Not Afraid and Love the Way You Lie, we got tracks like Spacebound, we got tracks like No Love, which are songs that I think are fantastic. Cinderella Man is a great one too. A personal favorite of mine is the closing track, Untitled. The rest do kind of hit that mid-tier category for me, but I think this one has a higher collection, a higher proportion of tracks that do still stand up today. Recovery was definitely a product of its time, even though I think some of these tracks just sound a little bit outdated in their production. You know, it's just like you kind of hear some of these tracks and you can just kind of tell that it is a late 2000s overblown, overproduced rap song that sounds totally epic. But I don't know. I enjoy some of these today. I do. I'm putting Recovery in B. And to be clear, this was also just a huge breath of fresh air for a lot of fans that hadn't really been vibing with anything Eminem had released since the Eminem Show, I guess. I do see how this one can divide the fan base a little bit because I think it marks the end of Eminem's slightly more raw sound, going into a more radio-friendly, more overproduced style of Eminem. But maybe it's just that personal connection as well, that this is what got me into Eminem, and I have plenty of memories from when I was an early teenager listening to tracks off of this album. So we'll keep it in B. We'll move on to the Marshall Mathers LP number 2. And I'm going to put this one in the same category as Recovery for pretty much the same reasons. Again, a higher proportion of tracks that I think stand up even to this day. I think this one has aged even a little bit better than Recovery. I find the low points to be just as low as on that record, and I find the high points honestly to be just as high as on that record. Not only this, but even though I feel there's like a slightly lower concentration of tracks that I find meaningful and could really make me feel something emotional, I think what it loses in that, it gains in Eminem's technical ability. Yes, rap god, obviously, but his flow is a little stronger. I think with the theme of this relating to his Marshall Mathers LP, on one hand does kind of show you that it is kind of nothing compared to that album, but does show an effort from Eminem to kind of like incorporate this newer Recovery style production with a couple more elements that he was more known for a long time ago at that point, back in the early 2000s. At some points these elements mix together beautifully, at some points it's like oil and water clashing, but regardless, I do think this one stands up today and maybe has even aged a little bit better than Recovery. With this mix of elements, some better, some worse, I feel comfortable putting this in the B category as well. Moving on to Revival, I can't stand it. I'd love to be the guy that's sitting here telling you, no, Revival actually has some good qualities to it. It doesn't. It was Eminem basically losing, selling out almost, of everything that made him who he was at this point. It's crazy that this is part of the Relapse Recovery trilogy. The best parts of this record are probably the features, just because I think these other artists end up showing a little bit more talent than Eminem does all over his own record. I believe this was the beginning of kind of the beginning of the end for Eminem. When the verses and the hooks are not extremely boring, they are just extremely cringy. I read another review about this one somewhere where they described it as Eminem running out of stories to tell, and I kind of get that feeling as well. He's either introducing new topics and themes that I don't care about, or he has like a very bad take on, or he's rehashing elements from his older self that just become so stale in the way that they're presented on Revival. I think at this point Eminem was truly no longer the same person that he was back at his beginning, but the music itself kind of remains in that immature setting and maybe almost goes backwards in a way. And I don't know, it's just kind of weird to see this older, more seasoned Eminem rehashing these elements in a way that just falls flat on its face. I don't know what else to say about it. It's an F. Is there redemption in Kamikaze? To me, you know, I think this one has a little bit more effort placed into it than Revival. Right away, I'm gonna put it in the E category. Not a complete failure, but boy, is this one also so lackluster for the standards, for the bar that Eminem has set for himself. It's a little bit more interesting. The flows are a little bit more crisp, but there's just so many issues that I had on Revival that are also present here. The design of these tracks is ridiculous in some cases. It feels like Eminem was unable to incorporate any emotional sounds into this record without being goofy or putting some veil over that by singing. Honestly, Revival's so weird because it's such a corny album, but I could almost like see how this one could have worked. Almost every track on here has like one or two things where were they to just be removed or changed completely, you could actually have a solid track on here. It really feels like a lot of these were intentionally made worse than they had to be. And I know that's not the case, but I don't know, man. That's kind of what it feels like. Not at the bottom, but close to it. Let's move on to Music to be Murdered By. And if I could mention one bad thing about this album, it's really Eminem's flow and delivery that just feels like he's not really trying to make anything unique anymore in a way that is meaningful to the listener. Is it as bad as the two records that came before it? Absolutely not. I'm actually going to throw this one in the C category. I would say it's a good mix of half and half, where half of these songs just sound maybe not horrendous, but so anonymous. Almost like they were written by an Eminem copycat that really didn't understand why Eminem became so popular. But it's definitely the best album in Eminem's bearded era. Even though there's not as much of a concentration of tracks on here that really sort of flip the script or show you a unique style, unlike the albums up here in the S, A, and B category, I think this one still shows that Eminem has the capacity to excite his audience, to create something that does slap, that is enjoyable. At this point, I'm honestly like toned out of any time that Eminem's trying to be emotional, because almost every time he does that, he essentially ruins it. The features on here don't really do much for me either. I like the Juice WRLD feature, but I just kind of like Juice WRLD in general, so I don't know if that really counts. But there were some tracks on here that worked. Not at the quality that Eminem is known for, but if he's gonna be making something at this time period, I guess Music to be Murdered By is the closest thing to what can work for Eminem at this point. So we'll keep this one in the C category and move on to the most recent album, The Death of Slim Shady. I have a full review for this one, so you already know where I'm gonna put this if you've seen that. This one's going in the D category. It feels like if there was any bit of momentum that we got from Music to be Murdered By, we just kind of lost it on this one. Not entirely, because I think there's like 3 tracks on here that really do hit home for me. Temporary, Somebody Save Me. I think these were great, meaningful tracks that Eminem was able to sort of incorporate some emotion in a kind of new way that actually worked. Also, while Houdini was a little bit cringeworthy, Toby was an awesome single. If anything, I could say that I wish Eminem had a slightly bigger presence on it, because I guess it is his album and his track at the end of the day. But at the same time, I think that incorporated 3 sort of equally sized sections of 3 fantastic rappers, sort of representing different eras in Detroit rap. Like, that's awesome. I love the idea of seeing Eminem bring these rappers on and really just kind of create this physical, visual representation of what Detroit rap is and used to stand for and still does stand for today. That was great. But while the tracks that I like took a step up, I think everything else did kind of take a step down after Music to be Murdered By. I've said it before, I'll say it again. It feels like Eminem thinks that the reason everybody is pissed off and that some people have stopped listening to him is because he's being so offensive, when in reality, it's just kind of the fact that he actually kind of just looks ridiculous doing it, and it's not even necessarily about what he's saying all the time. Even though what he is saying, yes, is intentionally trying to get him canceled, and it just rolls off the tongue so cringily here. So the tracks I like do save this one from being a complete flop, but I am rarely going to be listening to The Death of Slim Shady as a full album. I'm just going to be picking out the tracks that I like from that one. And there you have it. This is my tier list for Eminem. So here are my thoughts, but I would love to hear yours. Throw them in the comments. I will read everything, I promise. And with that said, I hope you all have a fantastic evening. Stay safe out there, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye, and see ya.